I have served as butler of Ashcroft House for 42 years, and in that time I have opened the front door to kings, generals, prime ministers, 3 archbishops, and a woman who arrived in a laundress's apron and left as a duchess. My name is Briggs. I do not use a Christian name in service, and after 42 years I am not entirely certain I remember it. The story I am about to tell concerns the autumn ball of 1819, the event the household still refers to, when they think I cannot hear them, as the night His Grace lost his mind. His Grace did not lose his mind. His Grace, for the first and perhaps only time in his 34 years, found it. But I understand why the household sees it differently, because what the Duke of Ashcroft did that evening was, by every measure of propriety and precedent and common aristocratic sense, extraordinary. The Duke of Ashcroft was the most eligible bachelor in England. I do not say this with exaggeration. I say it as a man who answered his correspondence and can report that in the year 1819 alone, the Duke received 114 letters from mothers introducing their daughters, 47 invitations to private suppers arranged around available young women, and 19 outright proposals of marriage forwarded through solicitors. He was tall, dark-haired, well-made, and possessed of a fortune that generated more income in a month than most families saw in a decade. He was also, by his own admission, bored. "They are all the same, Briggs," he told me one evening, standing before the mirror while I adjusted his cravat for yet another ball. "The same gowns, the same conversation, the same rehearsed laugh. They do not speak to me, they perform at me, and I am expected to choose one of them and call it love. Many gentlemen find contentment in such arrangements, Your Grace. Many gentlemen find contentment in hunting dogs and port. I require something more substantial. I did not ask what he required. It was not my place. But I had served him since he was a boy of 12, when his father had died and left him a dukedom and a house full of servants who had opinions about how a young duke should behave. And I had watched him grow from a solemn, observant child into a solemn, observant man who seemed to be waiting, with increasing impatience, for something the world had not yet provided. The autumn ball was held on the 23rd of October. It was the event of the season. 400 guests, 12 musicians, enough candles to illuminate a cathedral, and a supper that required the combined efforts of 3 cooks, 14 kitchen maids, and a pastry chef imported from Paris, who spoke no English and communicated entirely through the medium of threats and brandished whisks. I managed the household preparations with the precision I brought to all my duties, and I hired additional staff from the village to serve. Among the additional staff was Martha Fenn. I should tell you about Martha Fenn, because the world did not tell you about her, and that is precisely the point. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a laundress in the village of Ashcroft, and she had taken over her mother's work when her mother's hands grew too stiff with rheumatism to manage the linens. She washed and pressed and delivered for 12 households in the village, including 3 that belonged to the estate, and she did it with a quiet, unshowy competence that meant no one ever thought about her at all. She was not beautiful. I say this, not cruelly, but accurately, because accuracy is a butler's primary obligation. Her face was round and plain, her hair a brown that was not chestnut or honey or any of the poetic shades the novelists assign to heroines, just brown, pinned back with 2 plain pins. Her hands were rough from lye soap and hot water. She had no accomplishments. She could not play, could not sing, could not embroider, could not speak French. She could wash a silk gown without damaging it, fold a linen tablecloth into 24 precise sections, and remove a wine stain from a white cravat, using a method her mother had developed that worked better than anything the Duke's own valet could manage. These are not accomplishments that the world celebrates. They should be. I hired her to serve at the ball because she was reliable, presentable, and available, and because Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper, vouched for her character. She arrived at 6 o'clock on the evening of the ball, changed into the black dress and white apron of a serving maid, and took her position in the supper room with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had spent her life being looked through. The guests began arriving at 8. I stood at the front door and announced them. The Marquis of Devonbridge, Lady Alderton, the Honorable Miss Sinclair, and on and on. a parade of silk and diamonds, and rehearsed smiles. The Duke received them in the ballroom with the controlled courtesy he applied to everything, and the young women curtsied and blushed and performed their rehearsed laughs, and the Duke nodded and smiled and looked, behind his impeccable composure, exactly as bored as he had told me he was. At 9:30, the supper room opened. I was supervising the service, directing the footmen, monitoring the wine, ensuring that the turbot was served at the correct temperature, when I noticed the Duke standing in the doorway of the supper room. He was not looking at the guests. He was not looking at the food. He was looking at Martha Fenn. She was pouring wine. She was doing it the way she did everything, efficiently, unobtrusively, with the quiet precision of a woman who takes pride in work that no one notices. A guest had spilled claret on the tablecloth, and Martha had produced a cloth from her apron pocket and blotted it with 3 quick, expert movements that removed the stain completely, and then she had refilled the glass and moved on, and the guest had not looked at her, had not thanked her, had not registered her existence at all. The Duke had registered her existence. I watched him watch her for 7 minutes. I counted, because that is what butlers do. We count, we observe, we record, and we maintain the fiction that we have noticed nothing. He watched the way she moved through the room, not with the conscious grace of a woman who knows she is being observed, but with the unconscious economy of a woman who knows exactly where everything is and how to get to it without disturbing anyone. She anticipated the empty glass before the guest raised it. She cleared the used plate before the space was needed. She moved like water around stones, silently, inevitably, filling every gap without leaving a trace. At 10:22, the Duke crossed the supper room and spoke to her. I was close enough to hear. The room was loud. 400 guests produce a considerable volume. But the Duke spoke clearly, and Martha answered clearly, and their exchange cut through the noise with the precision of a bell. You removed that stain in 3 movements, the Duke said. Martha looked at him. She did not curtsy. She did not blush. She looked at him the way she looked at a difficult linen, with a practical assessment of the problem and a calm consideration of the solution. Yes, Your Grace. Claret on linen requires a cold cloth and pressure, not rubbing. Rubbing spreads it. Where did you learn that? From my mother, Your Grace. She has washed linens for 40 years. She has taught you well. She has taught me to pay attention, Your Grace. The rest follows. He looked at her for a moment, a long, considering look that I had never seen him give to any of the diamond-draped women in the ballroom, and then he nodded and walked away, and Martha continued pouring wine, as though the most powerful man in the county had not just spoken to her about laundry. But I saw his face as he turned, and I have seen many things in 42 years of service, but I had never seen that expression on the Duke of Ashcroft's face before. It was not the controlled courtesy he gave to guests. It was not the polite distance he maintained with women of his class. It was the look of a man who has been searching for something without knowing what it is, and has found it in the last place he expected. He came back twice more during the evening. The first time, he asked her about the method for pressing silk, a question so far below a duke's dignity that the footman beside me nearly dropped a tray. Martha explained it with the same practical clarity she brought to everything, and the Duke listened with the same focused attention he gave to parliamentary debates, and I understood that he was not asking about silk. He was asking about her. The second time, at midnight, the dancing was at its height, and the ballroom was a blaze of candlelight and swirling gowns. The most beautiful women in England were dancing with the most powerful men in England, and the Duke of Ashcroft was in the supper room, standing beside a serving table, asking Martha Fenn about her life. She told him about the laundry. She told him about her mother. She told him about the 12 households she served, and the way the work changed with the seasons, heavier linens in winter, finer fabrics in summer, the particular challenge of muddy riding habits in spring. She told him that she rose at 4 every morning, and that her favorite time was the hour before dawn, when the village was silent, and the light came slowly through the washhouse window, and the water was heating, and the world felt, for a little while, like it belonged to her. The hour before dawn, the Duke said. That is my favorite time as well. What do you do at that hour, Your Grace? I read, I walk the grounds. I sit in the library and listen to the house before it wakes. Then we are alike in that, Your Grace. We both prefer the world before it puts on its performance." I saw something happen to the Duke's face at that moment. The composure, the careful, maintained, aristocratic composure that he had worn like armor for 34 years, cracked, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not watching as closely as I was, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of the lips, the look of a man who has heard the truest thing anyone has ever said to him, and does not know what to do with the fact that it came from a woman in a servant's apron. What happened next is the part the household calls the night His Grace lost his mind. The Duke of Ashcroft walked out of the supper room. He crossed the entrance hall. He entered the ballroom, where 400 guests were dancing and drinking and performing their rehearsed delight. The music was playing, a waltz, I believe, something elegant and predictable. The Duke walked to the center of the floor. The dancers parted for him, the way dancers always parted for the Duke of Ashcroft, because he was the host and the most powerful man in the room, and you did not block the path of a duke. He stopped. He turned. He looked toward the supper room door. Martha was standing there. She had followed him as far as the doorway, not into the ballroom, because a serving maid does not enter the ballroom during a dance, and she was standing with her hands clasped over her apron, watching him with those steady, practical, unhorrified eyes. The Duke of Ashcroft extended his hand. The room went quiet. Not slowly, instantly. The music stopped. The dancers stopped. 400 people in silk and diamonds turned to look at the Duke, who was standing in the middle of his own ballroom with his hand extended toward a woman in a servant's apron and a plain brown dress. And the silence was so complete that I could hear the candles. "Miss Fenn," the Duke said, and his voice carried across that silent room with the clarity of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to explain it. "Will you dance with me?" Martha Fenn looked at his hand. She looked at the 400 faces staring at her, the shocked dowagers, the outraged mothers, the young women in their silk gowns who had spent months preparing for this evening and who were watching the most eligible man in England extend his hand to the laundress. She looked at me, standing by the door, and I gave her the smallest nod I have ever given in my life, because it was not my place to advise, and yet I could not help myself. She took his hand. They danced. Badly. Martha had never waltzed in her life, and she stepped on his foot twice in the first 8 bars, and she said, "I warned you I cannot dance." And he said, "Neither could I, until now," which made no sense, except that it made perfect sense, and the orchestra, recovering from their shock, began to play again, and 400 people watched the Duke of Ashcroft waltz with a laundress and saw the most extraordinary thing any of them had ever witnessed at a ball. A man who was not performing, a man who was, for the first time in their experience, happy. The county talked. The county could speak of nothing else for months. "He has gone mad," they said. "He will tire of her," they said. "She is nobody," they said. They said no lord would look twice. The Duke looked once, and never stopped. He called on her the next morning. He called on her every morning after that, walking from Ashcroft House to the village, to the small stone cottage where Martha lived with her mother. And he sat in their kitchen and drank their tea, and talked to Martha about linens and laundry, and the hour before dawn, and her mother watched from the corner, with the quiet, astonished gratitude of a woman who had prayed for her daughter's happiness without ever expecting it to arrive in the form of a duke. He proposed on a Wednesday in November, kneeling in the washhouse, not the drawing room, not the garden, the washhouse, because that was where Martha was, and he could not wait another hour. She said, "Your Grace, I am holding a bedsheet." And he said, "I do not care if you are holding the crown jewels, Martha. I am asking you to marry me." And she laughed, the first time he had made her laugh. And she said yes, with her arms full of linen and soapsuds on her wrists, and the Duke of Ashcroft kneeling on the wet stone floor in his best coat. And I stood in the doorway and permitted myself, for the first and only time in 42 years, to smile. She married him in December. She wore a white gown that she chose herself, simple, well made, without the excess that fashion demanded. and she walked into the church on her mother's arm, because her father was long dead, and her mother had earned the right. The county came, the county stared. The county saw the laundress's daughter in white silk walking toward the most powerful man in England, who was looking at her as though she were the only person in the room, which to him she was. They said no lord would look twice, but the Duke of Ashcroft had looked once, across a crowded supper room, at a woman pouring wine and removing a stain with 3 precise movements, and he had seen what the world had been too careless, too hurried, too dazzled by silk and diamonds to see, that Martha Fenn was not nobody. She was the most remarkable person in the room. She simply happened to be wearing an apron. I serve them still. The house is warmer now. The kitchen smells of the bread Martha bakes every Saturday, because she refused to give up baking when she became a duchess. The laundry is the finest in the county, because Martha reorganized it in her first month, and trained every maid in her mother's methods. And the Duke of Ashcroft, who spent 34 years being performed at by a world that never once showed him anything real, comes home every evening to a woman who tells him exactly what she thinks, pours his tea without ceremony, and looks at him, not at his title, not at his fortune, not at his face, with the steady, practical, unhorrified gaze of a woman who has spent her life paying attention and has decided that he is worth attending to. They said no lord would look twice. The Duke looked once and never stopped. And I, who have opened the door to kings, can tell you that the finest person who ever crossed the threshold of Ashcroft House came in through the servants' entrance, in an apron, carrying nothing but a cloth for stains, and the quiet certainty that good work, done well, is its own kind of nobility.